Morning. How are we? We good?
Yeah.
Yeah, just some of you are, some of you not quite so with it. Um, we're continuing our series, Faithful, this morning. Some of you will know that all the rooms in the Life Centre are named after great Christian men and women. We're in Wesley Hall, which has always struck me as quite interesting as a Baptist church having the main hall named after the founder of the Methodist Church. But let's brush over that, shall we? It's good to be inclusive, isn't it? And all the rooms are named after great men and women of God. And I suspect we will hear stories about some of them through this series. And I get first pick because Derek didn't pick one of them last time. So I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about one of my heroes, and that's Eric Liddell. The Liddell Hall is the one at the back where we have tea and coffee. But I love his story. It's told in the film Chariots of Fire, which may not be totally accurate to what his life was like. To me, it's a dream film. It's a mixture of sport and faith. I mean, it can't get any better than that. There aren't too many of those. But I love his story. He refused to run in the 100 metres on a Sunday in the Paris Olympics because of his faith. And that could have cost him a chance to win a gold medal. He was given the opportunity to switch to the 400 metres, and he won it, which was amazing. But he was a very famous athlete. He was so famous that he was the first person inducted into the Scottish Sports Hall of Fame. But he gave up that fame. He gave up what he could do with his sports to go to China as a missionary, and he eventually died there as quite a young man. What was it that drove him to live a life like that? What was it that made him faithful? Well, that's what our series is about. It's a series over the whole of this term to help us to become faithful, to those whose faith seems unshakable through the toughest times, to be those who make decisions that seem to make no sense. Last time, a couple of weeks ago, when Derek introduced the series, he talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian pastor in Germany, who at the start of World War II had the opportunity to go to New York. But when he got there, he felt he had to return to Germany, even though he was vocally opposed to Hitler, and that may be a threat to his life. And ultimately, that was what happened. He died during the Second World War. What builds that sort of faith? What builds the confidence in God to respond as he would want us to, and to live our relationships, to manage our money, to use our time, to make choices about our careers, to have our dreams and goals driven by faith in God? What makes us live as though Jesus was right by our side? Well, over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about 5 keys that we believe God uses to help our faith to grow. Some of them are keys that we have some control over. Some of them we don't. And we're going to spend 2 Sundays on each of these keys. So next week, Andy will have the chance to put right the things that I've said wrong, to fill in the gaps of the things that I've omitted. Perhaps there's a lesson there somewhere. But we did something in Life Group this week. Many of you might have done the same. Was we answered the question, what or who has helped your faith to grow? And I'm pleased to say that our Life Group, being the great Life Group that it is, as we had those conversations, all the 5 things that we're going to talk about came out in those conversations. So I don't think what we're going to talk about is going to be a huge shock to you. I hope it won't be. But they are, we think, really important to help us grow to be faithful people. So hopefully on Sundays, in life groups, on our social media, there'll be things coming out that are going to help all of us. And that should help us whatever season of life we're in, whether we're still at school, whether we're just about to go to university or to college, whether we're working or retired, whether we're single or married, whether we're healthy or whether we're facing challenges, whatever life is like for us, we want to be people who are full of faith. So, The key that we're starting with, and I can sense the excitement in the room because we've been keeping these quite quiet, haven't we? And I'm only going to tell you one. I'm not going to tell you the other four. You're going to have to come back in future weeks to get those. So we're starting with positive obedience. Positive obedience. I got a from, it was either my wife or from Emma. I thought she would have known what the 5 keys were, being who she is. Positive obedience. We're not starting because that's the most important. We think all 5 of these are really important. As you read through the Gospels, the 4 books that tell us about Jesus' life on earth, many times we see that Jesus calls people to follow him, not just to believe in him. Our faith needs to be active. It isn't just a head thing for us. We need to be doing things. It needs to be applied. And when our applied faith interacts with God's faithfulness, then that helps our faith to grow. And in that way, we're being a follower of Jesus. In fact, we're being a disciple. A disciple just means someone who follows Jesus, not just being a believer. So when you feel a nudge from Jesus to do something, perhaps to go and apologize to a friend, or go and sit with someone that's looking lonely or sad, and then that conversation goes better than you imagined that it would do, then your faith grows. It grows because you heard Jesus. It goes because you responded and applied what he said to you. And it grows because God was faithful in that moment. And then your faith's just a little bit stronger. So the next time you hear something that might sound a little bit riskier, you go, I remember when I responded before, and that went well. So there's a positive sense of reinforcement. Now, not everything we do will go perfectly. I understand that. And not everything will have an outcome that is immediately positive. But sometimes it will. It's a bit like our muscles. Our faith is like a muscle. If we use it, it will grow. I'm looking around the room. I can see many of you go to the gym. I can see many of you don't. But those of you who do, you can see when you go to the gym, your muscles grow. And then if you have a holiday or you have an injury and you have a few weeks off, that muscle starts to waste away a little bit. It's the same with our faith. If we don't exercise our faith, it doesn't actually stay the same. It gets smaller. We need to exercise it. We're going to read a few verses from the end of Matthew chapter 7. That's the end of what's called the Sermon on the Mount, a long chunk of Jesus' teaching, which was very challenging for the people who were listening to it. Quite a lot of it challenged those who had power and authority, to challenge them about how they were using that. Were they using it for their benefit? Were they using it for others? So if someone asked you to do something, Jesus said you should do more than you're asked. You should be generous and open-hearted. If someone hurts you, you should forgive them freely, not with any limitations or not with any constraints. You should forgive as the Lord forgives you. And in fact, Jesus goes further and says you should pray for your enemy and not pray for them to be destroyed, but pray for their lives to be blessed. Jesus says you shouldn't criticize others until you've looked in a mirror and looked at your own life and seen what's wrong with you. Just begins to give a flavor for how challenging Jesus' teaching is. Jesus' teaching is hard, and if you're going to follow him, it's tough. And your life needs to change. But Jesus' invitation to follow him is to do life differently. This is the passage from Matthew 7. At the end of this teaching that he's given, he says this: "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. This is quite a bombshell from Jesus here. We might not recognize it perhaps because these words are familiar to us. But these last few verses of the sermon are amazing. As the crowds listen, already they will have been quite amazed by what Jesus has been saying. And then Jesus says, everyone who hears these words of mine and believes them, no. Remembers them, no. Writes them down, no. Studies them at great length, no. Agrees with them, no. Feels convicted by them, no. Goes away and tells others about them, no. Jesus says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. All those other things might be things that we do, and they're not necessarily bad things, but Jesus says we have to put them into practice. He's calling us then and now into an active, following, obedient relationship with him. Jesus says that's a wise thing to do. It's about establishing a life that is solid, secure, storm protected. For we can be sure that life for all of us, whether we're following Jesus or not, is full of storms. And Jesus says only houses, only lives that are built on rock can withstand those storms. That's part of what becoming a faithful follower of Jesus is. Having a life that can withstand whatever comes at us. Rock is hard, solid, takes a lot to move it. Rock exists to show something of who God is. Sometimes we get this the wrong way round, and we think the biblical writers had an inspired moment and came upon an image of God by seeing something in creation and assigning it to God. I think it's the other way around. In Romans 1, Paul says this: since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So God made rock so we would have something that helps us to understand something of who God is. His dependability, his solidity, his immovability, and that it's someone to help us see that it's something that we build a life on. But building on rock is not easy, unlike building on sand. If you want to build a house quickly, build it on sand. Quick dig, you can put some foundations down and you're done. Your house will be finished quickly. But as Jesus says, it's not likely to last when those tough times come along. I'm quite a fan of the program Grand Designs. I think I might have said this before. I became slightly addicted a few months ago. I'm gradually weaning myself off. But the new series has started and it's amazing. But quite often in those programs, one of the key issues is how are they going to build foundations? Because these mad people who decide they want to build their dream house quite often pick quite inappropriate bits of land that are soft where there's nothing. And one of the challenges is always to dig down to find something solid to build their house on. But that can be quite hard work. And building on rock is quite hard work, because you have to dig down into the rock to make it solid. Today we've got powerful machines that can do that for us, and even perhaps a bit of dynamite to blow something that's getting in the way, and then you can start the foundations. However, when Jesus was giving this sermon 2,000 years ago, they didn't have diggers and yellow machines and dynamite to help them. If they wanted to build a foundation into rock, that was going to be labor intensive, hard work. It would be expensive to get people to do that, but it would be worth it. If you just build on top of the rock without digging into it, that doesn't work at all. You need to dig into the rock so that your house is well connected. We need to dig into the rock that is Jesus' teaching so that our lives are well connected. Jesus says the man or woman who took that time to build well on the rock is wise. And that means listening to what Jesus says, but not just listening, but obeying. Not just agreeing with his good ideas, not just telling others about his good ideas, but following what he says for us to do. It will cost you more. It will take more time. It will be hard, but it will be worth it. It's one of the keys for us becoming faithful. If we're never doing anything that Jesus says to us, are we actually following him? How can we call ourselves a disciple, a follower of Jesus, if we never do anything that he says to us? That's not to say what we do makes us a Jesus follower. It's not to say we're saved because of that, but what we do shows who we are. When we decide to obey, when we trust what Jesus says to us, when we take those perhaps what naturally sound unwise or strange or difficult, then God is doing something in us. But as we obey positively, and that obedience intersects with what God's faithfulness, our faith will grow. And the next time, it will be a little easier. Let me give you an example. I can't remember when, I think it was 8 or 9 years ago, I felt challenged by God about how I responded to things that people asked of me. Because my default, very strong default, was to say no. My wife is looking at me in agreement. But I felt God challenging me about that. So I decided that I was going to have a year of yes. Now, my wife and kids were delighted by this. At this, what they hoped would be a significant change in my behaviour. And that's what I did. And I announced it to them. I think I might have even announced it to the church. Now, that didn't mean that I said yes to everything. But it was my starting point of when someone asked me something, my initial response was, yes, can we make that happen? Rather than a straight no. And I felt God did do something to me during that year. And it was significant because a couple of years later, and some of you will have heard this story, I was having a conversation with Andy at a wedding, and he talked about this new role that they were creating in Life Church. And as I've said before, something in me jumped. It was probably the Holy Spirit. It probably wasn't a bit of indigestion, but something in me jumped when he talked about this role. And as we began to explore it a little bit, my default answer to come to Manchester was yes. I think if I hadn't responded to God's prompting a couple of years before, where he did something in me, then when that conversation about Manchester started, it would have been much harder for me to say yes. You see, my faith had grown. By being obedient in one thing, God was actually using that to get me ready for something else. I don't want you to think I'm perfect, so I'm going to tell another story now. Mel and I have done a little bit of canoeing over the summer. And we were on holiday in Tenby, and we went out canoeing one day, and we paddled along the coast, and then there was a headland, and then about a kilometre the other side, there was an island. I'm getting looks from my wife. You'll understand why. So we paddled along for a while, and I wanted to paddle along the headland and into the channel between the headland and the island. Mel was less keen, shall we say. Mel was clearly less keen, but I felt that it would be fine, and I wanted to go a little bit further. As we got further along the edge of the headland, we got stuck in a whirlpool. And there was a whirlpool, and we were in it, and no matter which way we paddled, it felt like we weren't getting very far. Eventually, We did get out without the lifeboat having to come out, although wouldn't that have been cool to be rescued by the... No. We did get out. We had what can be described as a fairly frosty paddle home. And rest of the day and evening out at the Italian restaurant. And in our family now, an Italian meal is code for I need to talk to you about something. Now, Mel didn't know there was a whirlpool there. But if I had listened to her, I wouldn't have got into trouble. And God's like that with us. Sometimes he asks us to do something, or asks us not to do something. And it doesn't make any sense. But he can be protecting us from getting us into trouble. If I'd listened to my wife, the rest of my day would have been much nicer. If God asks you to do something, just be obedient, because he may be saving you from a heap of trouble. I just want to think again about Eric Liddell, and perhaps there's something of that positive obedience that we see in him. He knew that observing Sundays was significant, not playing sport on Sundays was important, so he made that stand, even though it looked like it would cost him a chance of a gold medal in the 100 metres that he'd been training for. He was obedient, and God gave him another chance in another race, the 400 metres, and he won gold in that. His obedience, combined with God's faithfulness, meant his faith would have grown. On the basis of that, and I'm sure on other things as well, he could then respond in obedience to God's call to go to China. And he stayed there until he died in a Japanese internment camp in the Second World War, aged 43. His obedience took him to where God wanted him to be. That wasn't going to be an easy life. It wasn't a long life. But he lived it well. It was reported that the last words he spoke were, "It's complete surrender." Not to the Japanese, but surrender in obedience to Jesus. And through his life, he left a legacy in athletics, in the work of the China Inland Mission, but also in the Chinese community, in the city of Weifang. 60 years after he died, the city laid a wreath in memory of him and all that he had done. Being obedient, listening to what Jesus says, and doing it is not an easy choice. It's not necessarily going to take you where you would choose to go. But that's what being a follower of Jesus is. And that's the message for today. In some ways, it's quite simple. And in some ways, it's really difficult. We're called not just to believe in Jesus, not just to assent to what he says. We're called to follow him by being positively obedient. But we know that that isn't easy. But the more that we do it, in some ways, the easier it gets. So as we come to the end of our time, I think the challenge for today, and almost the challenge for every day, should be this: what is God saying to me today? And what do I need to do about that? Sometimes it can be helpful to add a third question: who am I going to tell? Because accountability with one another can help us in reinforcing that obedience. God speaks to us in lots of different ways. He speaks to us as we read the Bible. He speaks to us on a Sunday morning when we gather together. He'll speak to us in life group. He may speak to you through a friend. He might speak through creation. God is a God who speaks today. And we need to respond to what he says. We need to have an ear to listen, but we need to make choices to obey. Just receiving Jesus' truth and doing nothing with it is like having a can of paint that you put in your garage and do nothing with. Might look a nice, pretty can, but that's not what paint is for. Jesus' truth into our life is not just to be listened to. Its purpose is to be applied. As I've been talking, you may have heard God speaking to you about something. God may have been speaking to you during this week, and you've still yet to respond. Maybe somebody's asked you to help them with something, and you've not responded with that. And God's saying he wants you to be generous. He wants you to be open-handed with them. Maybe there's someone that you need to apologize to. Someone that you know you've done something wrong to, and you need to restore that relationship. Or maybe you've been hurt by someone and you're holding on to that hurt because they've done it again and again and again, and they're just not learning. God's perhaps calling you to forgive them again. Perhaps in your heart you're criticizing someone. You want to pick them up on something that they're doing wrong, and you're not looking at your own life. Perhaps God's saying, look in the mirror and listen to what I'm saying to you. Perhaps God's challenging you about how you use your money or your time or something else. If God's been speaking to you about something, it's just going to take a moment for us to think, what has God said to you? What are you going to do about that? Who are you going to tell? How you need to respond. Don't let God's word to you go to waste. I'm just going to pray. Lord, thank you for calling us to be your followers. Thank you for calling us to be in relationship with you. Lord, would you help us to grow in positive obedience to you? Help us to hear you speaking and help us to respond, that we may see our obedience intersect with your faithfulness. Help us to respond to what you've said to each of us today. Please be helping our faith to grow, that we may be faithful people and a faithful church. We ask this in your name, Lord Jesus. Amen.